The cabin was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A small, isolated spot in the middle of nowhere. Just me, a weekend away from the chaos of daily life, a quiet retreat to unwind. It was a small log cabin tucked away in the woods, with nothing but trees and dirt roads stretching for miles around. The cabin was rented through a website, one of those off-the-grid places where you could escape modern life and be completely alone. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky but starting to dip behind the thick canopy of trees. The road leading up to the cabin had been long and bumpy, the tires of my old truck bouncing over the gravel as I made my way into the wilderness. The place was exactly as the listing had described, rustic and charming. The wood beams, the fireplace, the cozy furniture. It was everything I had hoped for, except for one thing: insects. First, I didn't think much of it. There was the occasional fly buzzing near the window, a few ants marching along the floorboards. Nothing out of the ordinary for a cabin in the woods. But then I started noticing more, a lot more. They were in the corners of the ceiling, crawling in the cracks of the wooden walls. I didn't want to let it ruin my stay, so I brushed it off, thinking I could just kill a few and move on. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized how bad it actually was. I went to the kitchen to start preparing some dinner, trying to ignore the crawling things around me. I opened the cabinets, and that's when I saw them. Tiny, pale insects scurrying across the shelves, their legs moving in quick, jerky motions. A few roaches, a dozen or so ants. I slammed the door shut, a feeling of unease settling over me. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven back to the nearest town. But I didn't. I was too determined to make this work. Dinner wasn't much, just a few cans of soup I had brought with me. I set them on the counter and noticed a few more insects crawling around the floor, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something about this felt wrong. It wasn't just the insects, it was the silence. The thick, suffocating silence of the woods that seemed to stretch on forever. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just the sound of the occasional insect clicking on the walls. I tried to distract myself by sitting on the old leather couch near the fire, but the longer I sat there, the worse it got. I kept feeling like I was being watched, but there was no one around. Nothing but the relentless sound of tiny legs skittering over wood, over stone, over every surface. The flickering shadows from the fire danced on the walls, but they felt more like ghosts than comforting light. When night fell, I was still awake, lying in the bed, eyes wide open. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something crawling over me. It wasn't just in my mind. The insects were here with me, and they were getting worse. In the dim light, I saw them. Large beetles with shells as black as oil, creeping along the walls. They were so quiet I almost couldn't hear them, but I could see the little legs moving, twitching with each step they took. I pulled the blanket up over my head, as if that would protect me, but I knew it wouldn't. I spent the entire night tossing and turning, the feeling of insects crawling over my skin, the low buzz of flies in my ears. It wasn't just the sight of them. It was the sensation, the knowing that they were everywhere, hidden in the shadows. By morning, I had barely slept. When I got out of bed, I stumbled into the bathroom, trying to shake the grogginess from my head. I turned on the lights and froze. The bathroom was covered in them. Roaches, ants, tiny, wriggling worms. A thick layer of bugs covered the walls, the sink, the floor. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, and it was fighting back. I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't just a mild infestation. This was something more. They were everywhere, crawling up my arms, falling from the ceiling. They seemed to be coming from nowhere, appearing out of cracks, out of crevices, from under the floors. It was like the cabin was alive with them. I backed away from the bathroom, heart racing. My mind spun with panic. I couldn't stay here another night. Couldn't. But when I grabbed my keys and rushed outside, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The front porch, usually a peaceful, serene place, was teeming with them. Ants swarmed across the wooden floor, and the air was thick with a strange, buzzing sound. I didn't know where they were coming from. I didn't know how to stop it. They were everywhere. I jumped back into my truck, slamming the door behind me, and took off down the road, not even caring about the gravel scratching against my tires. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the insects following me, crawling across the dirt, chasing me through the woods. It wasn't until I was halfway back to civilization that I realized I had left something behind. Not something I could touch or see, but something I could feel. The cabin had left its mark on me, deep down, a fear that stayed with me long after I had escaped. A fear that no matter where I went, no matter how far I drove, the insects would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to return. I didn't know if it was just the isolation or something more sinister, but one thing was clear. That cabin wasn't just full of insects. It was full of something else, something that made them gather in such numbers. I didn't know what, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. When I finally made it to a small town, I stopped at a diner to regroup. I sat at the counter, hands shaking as I tried to get my bearings. The waitress, an older woman, gave me a strange look when I ordered a coffee. I probably looked like I had just escaped something, which, in a way, I had. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that it was just a bad night, a weird situation that I had overreacted to. But I knew the truth. I had barely escaped whatever that cabin was hiding, whatever was calling those insects to it. The cabin was gone now. I had reported it to the authorities, but they said they couldn't find anything wrong with the place. No structural issues, no health hazards, just a rundown cabin in the woods. And the insects were still there, waiting for the next person to stay, waiting for the next victim. I wasn't that victim, not this time, but as I sit here now, in this quiet town, I still feel them, crawling on me, behind me, waiting. I wonder if they'll ever stop, or if I'll ever stop feeling the weight of that place on my shoulders. And as I sip my coffee, I realize one thing for certain. I will never, ever go back to that cabin again. I don't think I was supposed to find that cabin. It wasn't on any map, and no one ever talked about it. But I found it, deep in the woods, past the old cemetery where the gravestones leaned at odd angles, half swallowed by the earth. And once I found it, I couldn't leave. This was years ago. I was 29 at the time, working maintenance for a small county in the Midwest. My job was simple: clean up parks, fix broken benches, make sure trails weren't overgrown. I worked alone most days, which suited me fine. I wasn't much for conversation. The graveyard wasn't my usual assignment. It was tucked away on the outskirts of town, barely used anymore. The last burial had been over a decade ago. The county only sent someone out once a year to clear fallen branches and keep the weeds from swallowing the place whole. That year, it was my turn. I took my truck down a dirt path that wound through the trees, the kind that only looked like a road if you already knew it was there. The further I went, the worse it got. Roots breaking through the packed earth, deep ruts filled with rainwater. By the time I reached the graveyard, my tires were caked in mud, and I knew I'd have a hell of a time getting back out. The place was just as forgotten as I'd expected. The iron gate hung open, rusted hinges long since frozen in place. Rows of headstones stretched between the trees, some barely visible through the undergrowth. A few had names I recognized, old family names from around town, people who had died long before I was born. I got to work clearing the worst of the debris. A storm had passed through the week before, and fallen branches littered the ground. I hauled them into piles, making a path through the headstones. It was slow work. The air was thick with humidity, and mosquitoes swarmed around me. That's when I saw it. Beyond the far edge of the graveyard, past a row of crumbling tombstones, the trees opened up just enough to show something hidden in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another shadow between the trunks. But the longer I looked, the clearer it became. A cabin barely visible through the dense woods. It was old, older than the graveyard itself by the look of it. The roof sagged, the walls darkened with age. Vines crawled up one side, reaching for the windows like they were trying to pull the place back into the earth. I hadn't seen it on my way in, and I knew for a fact it wasn't on any of the county's maps. I should have left it alone, but something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe it was the way the woods felt different near it. Quieter, like the usual sounds of the forest had faded away. I told myself I just wanted to take a closer look, to see if it was really abandoned. I stepped off the path, moving carefully through the undergrowth. The ground was soft, damp from the recent rain. My boots sank into it with each step. The closer I got, the stronger that strange silence became.
No birds.
No wind, just the distant buzz of insects. When I reached the cabin, I could see how bad of shape it was in. The wood was warped, the windows clouded with dirt. A small porch jutted out from the front, the railing long since rotted away. The door was closed, but not locked. It hung slightly open, just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. I hesitated. Something about it didn't feel right. Not in a haunted way, I didn't believe in that kind of thing. But there was a weight to the air, like the place was waiting for something. I told myself I was being stupid. It was just an old building, probably forgotten decades ago. If anything, it was a piece of history. No harm in taking a look. I stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, softer than it should have been. The door swung open a little more, the hinges letting out a tired groan. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust coated everything. An old table, a single wooden chair, the remains of a fireplace. It looked like no one had been here for years. But then I noticed something. The dust wasn't even. In the middle of the floor, a trail of footprints cut through it, leading from the doorway to the back of the cabin. They were fresh. I froze. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A sound, so soft I almost missed it. A breath coming from the back room. I didn't wait to see who it was. I stepped back, ready to bolt. But my foot hit something, a loose floorboard. It groaned under my weight, the sound splitting through the silence. And then movement. Something shifted in the back room. Slow, deliberate. A shadow passed across the doorway. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I tore through the undergrowth, branches whipping against my arms. My truck was still parked by the cemetery, and I ran for it like my life depended on it. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me. My heart pounded in my ears. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the mud as I yanked the truck around and sped down the dirt path. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if anyone was watching. I never told anyone about the cabin. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to know. Some things are better left alone, and I never went back to that graveyard again. I never thought I'd be here, sitting alone in a small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of a forest. The kind of forest you'd think twice about walking through after dark. The trees stretch endlessly, their silhouettes sharp and ominous against the fading twilight sky, the sort of place you see in old horror movies, where you know something bad is going to happen. But, of course, this wasn't a movie. It was real life. I had taken a job, one that promised a peaceful, quiet few days away from the chaos of the city. A guy named Dan, a friend of a friend, had told me about a cabin up north, perfect for someone who needed to escape. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. No one around, no distractions, just me, the forest, and a chance to reset. I didn't ask too many questions. Perhaps I should have. When I arrived, it didn't take long for me to realize that quaint wasn't quite the word I'd used to describe this cabin. It was old, weathered, with a sagging roof and cracked windows. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but that's what I had expected. The outside was covered in a thick layer of moss, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. I wasn't sure what I had been expecting, but it wasn't this. Yet I was here now, and it was too late to back out. The inside was worse. The air smelled musty, stale, like it hadn't been aired out in decades. There was a small wood-burning stove in the corner, but it was cold and had clearly been unused for a long time. The furniture, what little there was old and worn, the wood scratched and chipped, as if it had seen better days long ago. A faded rug lay on the floor, barely recognizable beneath the dust and dirt. The walls were lined with shelves that held a few dusty old books, a couple of fishing rods, and random tools. There was a single bed in the corner, a small table, and a rickety old chair. I set my bag down on the floor and took a deep breath. It was quieter than I had imagined. The wind outside howled through the trees, but inside, it felt like time had stopped. I was alone. It felt peaceful at first, but as the hours passed, a nagging unease crept in. There was something about this place that just didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the isolation. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes your thoughts louder, heavier. The kind of silence that you can't escape, no matter how much you try to ignore it. As evening fell and the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon, the temperature in the cabin dropped. I started a fire in the stove to stave off the chill. I hadn't seen a single soul since arriving, not a car, not even a person walking by. I was completely alone, and that's how it was supposed to be. But as the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were all locked. The last thing I wanted was to be caught off guard by some wild animal, or worse, a trespasser. But as I stood by the window, looking out into the blackness of the forest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a shape, barely visible in the darkness, moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my eyes playing games with me, but no. There was something there, a figure. It moved with purpose, slow but deliberate, as though it was watching the cabin. I pulled away from the window, heart pounding in my chest. The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak and groan, but I couldn't focus on that. My eyes kept darting back to the window, to the shape outside, to whatever it was that didn't belong. I couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The thought that I wasn't alone hit me hard. The fire crackled in the stove, but it felt colder inside now, the air heavier. I paced the cabin, my mind racing with possibilities. Could be an animal, some kind of wildlife, maybe a bear or a deer, but no, this was too deliberate. It wasn't moving like any animal I knew. It was a person, someone out there, in the dark, circling my cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around me. There was no sign of anyone, no tracks, no broken branches. It was as though the figure had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind rustling the leaves, but there was nothing, just the unsettling silence. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I hadn't slept much the night before and the isolation was starting to get to me. I returned to the cabin, locked the door behind me, and tried to push the unsettling feeling aside. I was just tired, I told myself. The figure outside was probably nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that figure returned to my mind. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin, branches snapping, footsteps in the dirt. I'd get up, grab the flashlight, and check around the cabin, but I never found anything. It was as though the forest itself was conspiring against me, playing tricks on my mind. The next morning, I decided to leave. Something about the cabin, about the forest, was gnawing at me. I wasn't sure if I was just tired or if I was being overly cautious, but I didn't want to take any chances. I packed my things quickly, hoping that once I left, everything would feel normal again. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Fresh footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin and into the trees. The prints were large, far too big to belong to any animal I knew. And there were no other tracks, no sign of anyone walking the other way. They led deeper into the forest. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through me. Whoever or whatever had been outside last night was still out there, watching me. I grabbed my bag, slammed the trunk shut, and got into my car as fast as I could. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just needed to get out of there. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me, the forest slowly receding in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my hands still shaking on the wheel. When I checked into a motel that night, I didn't feel safe, not fully. The unease lingered, like a shadow that I couldn't shake off. I had thought the cabin was supposed to offer solitude, peace, but it had only given me a sense of dread. The kind of dread that follows you even after you've left the place behind. I never did find out who or what was out there in the woods, but I learned one thing that night. Some places are better left alone. The world is full of hidden corners, quiet places where things don't always make sense, and sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and never look back. As I sat in that motel room, finally able to breathe without the weight of the forest pressing down on me, I realized I'd never go back to that cabin. Not because I was scared, but because whatever it was that watched me that night, whatever it was that lurked in the trees, wasn't something I could ever face again. Some things, I guess, are just meant to stay hidden. It was late autumn when we got the orders. The cold had settled in early that year, creeping in through the cracks in our barracks, making every breath visible in the dim light of morning. We had been stationed at a remote base, a temporary outpost near the edge of a dense forest that stretched for miles in every direction. The land was rugged, barely touched by civilization, except for a few old dirt roads and abandoned hunting cabins scattered deep in the woods. Our unit had been running reconnaissance in the region for weeks. It wasn't a war zone, at least not in the traditional sense, but something was off about the area. A few locals lived in the scattered farmhouses along the dirt roads, mostly older folks who had been there for generations, but we barely saw them. When we did, they were quiet, reserved, and always in a hurry to be somewhere else. The mission came down from higher command late one evening. Intelligence had picked up signs of suspicious activity in an old woodsman's cabin about 20 miles from our base. It was supposed to be abandoned, yet satellite images showed movement. Shadows passing in and out at odd hours, figures that seemed to disappear when checked again. There were no lights, no fires, nothing that indicated people were living there. Just movement, faint trails in the dirt, disturbances in the foliage that weren't there before. A four-man team was selected for the operation. We were given coordinates, briefed on the layout of the land, and told to investigate the cabin. If it was occupied, we were to assess the threat level and report back. If necessary, we were to neutralize hostiles. No questions, no delays. We left before sunrise, moving in a tight formation through the dense underbrush. The terrain was rough, full of uneven ground, tangled roots, and thick patches of brambles that slowed our progress. The air was damp, carrying the smell of rotting leaves and wet earth. The first few miles were uneventful. We kept our movements careful, avoiding the few game trails we encountered. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Birds had been chirping when we left, but as the hours passed, the forest seemed to lose its sound. The silence wasn't complete. There were still the occasional rustles of small animals in the undergrowth, the creaking of tree limbs shifting in the breeze, but there was an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We reached the cabin just before noon. It was smaller than I expected, tucked into the trees so well that it almost blended into the landscape. The wood was old, dark with age, and parts of the roof had collapsed inward. There was a single entrance, a heavy wooden door that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. No signs of movement, no fresh tracks. We spread out, covering different angles as we approached. The windows were boarded up, gaps between the planks barely wide enough to see inside. The smell of damp wood and decay hung in the air. I ran my fingers over the door frame. It was solid, but there were scratches along the edges, as if something had tried to force its way in or out. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a space that was almost empty. Dust and debris covered the floor, broken furniture lay scattered, and a heavy smell of mildew filled the air. The fireplace was cold, the hearth covered in soot and bits of charred wood that had long since turned to ash. We moved carefully, checking every corner, but there was nothing. No food, no supplies, no signs that anyone had lived there recently. Just old, rotting wood and the weight of silence pressing in from all sides. Then we found the trapdoor. It was near the back of the cabin, partially hidden beneath a pile of broken chairs. The wood was newer than the rest of the floor, a rough square outline barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. No handle, no hinges on the surface. Whoever built it didn't want it found. We pried it open with the edge of a knife, revealing a narrow tunnel leading down into darkness. The air that rose from below was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent. We descended one by one, weapons ready, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The tunnel walls were rough, carved from packed earth reinforced with old wooden beams. It led deeper than I expected, the slope dragging us further underground with each step. The silence down there was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like sound itself was being swallowed. Then we saw the first room. It was small, barely large enough for a single person to stand in, but the walls were covered in marks. Deep gouges carved into the dirt and wood, chaotic and random. The floor was packed down, stained dark in patches that I didn't want to think about. Then there were the chains. They hung from the walls, rusted but still strong. Some were broken, ends twisted and bent as if something had fought to get free. Others remained intact, bolts driven deep into the wooden beams. We kept moving. The tunnel branched off into more rooms, all similar, small, cramped, marked with scratches, some containing old, rusted tools that didn't belong in a place like this. There were no bodies, no direct evidence of what had happened there, but the air was thick with the weight of something terrible. Then we found the tunnel's end. It opened into a larger space, a cavern dug deep beneath the forest. The walls were uneven, rough, but the floor was lined with old wooden planks. In the center stood a table, long, heavy, stained with something dark, and surrounding it were the remains. Old bones, scattered across the floor, piled in some places, half buried in others. Some were animal, deer, and smaller creatures, but not all. That's when we heard the sound. It came from the tunnel behind us, soft at first, almost like breathing, then the faint scrape of something dragging along the ground. We turned, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the silence, the heavy stillness pressing in from all sides. Then something moved, a shadow just beyond the edge of our lights, shifting against the tunnel walls. We didn't wait to see more. We backed out fast, moving up the tunnel in formation, keeping our weapons ready. The scraping sound followed, growing faster, more erratic. As we reached the ladder, I turned back for one last look. Something was there, crouched low, just beyond the tunnel's bend. I couldn't see its face, but I saw the shape. Long limbs, fingers splayed against the ground, the glint of something sharp in the dim light. Then it moved, fast. We scrambled up the ladder, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us, barricading it with anything we could find. The silence returned. We left the cabin without looking back, moving through the forest at double speed. By the time we reached our base, the sun was setting. We reported everything, what we found, what we saw. Higher command sent another team to investigate the next day. They found the cabin. They found the tunnel. But the rooms were empty.
No bones. No chance.
No marks on the walls. Just dirt, packed smooth, as if nothing had ever been there. The official report marked it as an abandoned shelter. No further action needed. But we knew what we saw, and we knew something was still out there, waiting in the dark beneath the trees. It was early autumn when my gym partner, Jason, and I decided to take a break from the grind. We'd been pushing ourselves at the gym for months, and we both needed some time away, time to decompress. After a bit of planning, we booked a cabin in the woods, the kind of place you'd expect to find on the edge of a small, remote town. It was supposed to be peaceful, just us, a few days of hiking, and my dog, Max, who was always up for a good adventure. The cabin was tucked away on a dirt road, a good couple of miles from any neighbors. It was a little run down, but in a charming, rustic way. There was an old porch that creaked underfoot, and the windows were framed with thick, weathered wood. It was everything you'd expect from a remote getaway, isolated and quiet, surrounded by towering pines and the sound of rustling leaves. Jason and I were excited. Max, our golden retriever, was already bounding out of the car, his tail wagging wildly. I set up the cabin while Jason took care of getting our gear unloaded. It wasn't a big place, but it had everything we needed. A wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a fireplace that looked like it had seen better days. After a couple of hours of settling in, we decided to take Max for a walk through the woods. It was crisp outside, the air smelling of damp earth and pine needles, and we figured a good hike would help clear our minds. We had planned to stay for the weekend, and the first day passed without incident. We walked, talked, and enjoyed the stillness. It felt good to be out of the city, far from the noise of traffic, the pressure of deadlines, and the usual distractions. As the sun set, we returned to the cabin, built a fire, and sat down to a simple meal. The kind of thing you only appreciate in the quiet of nature, a feeling of contentment that only came from being completely disconnected. Night settled in fast, and the darkness outside the cabin was thick. No streetlights, no sounds of civilization, just the occasional rustle of wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire inside. I was feeling good, but there was something unsettling about the silence. It felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. Later that night, after a few beers, we started to unwind. Jason and I were sitting on the old couch, Max curled up at our feet. when the silence was broken by a distant sound. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the snap of a twig. It was too deliberate to be an animal, and we both paused, exchanging a quick glance. The cabin had no neighbors nearby, and there shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The dogs always gave us a sense of comfort in these situations, but even Max seemed to sense something. His ears perked up, eyes darting toward the window. Jason got up to check the front door, peering out through the crack in the blinds. Nothing. No movement. He shook his head. Probably just a deer or something. I wanted to believe that, but a nagging feeling was starting to creep up my spine. It didn't make sense. Max was still on edge, staring out into the blackness. And then, a sound again. Closer this time. It wasn't a snap. It was more like footsteps, crunching in the underbrush. I felt my pulse quicken. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jason nodded, tension lining his jaw. "Yeah, I heard it." We stayed there in silence, straining our ears to catch any further sounds. Max started whining softly, his head turning toward the door. Then suddenly the sound stopped. Absolute silence once more. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or even more on edge. Jason grabbed a flashlight. "I'm going to take a look around the perimeter." "I'll go with you," I said, pulling on my jacket. We made our way outside, the chilly night air biting at our skin. The woods were dense around the cabin, and the flashlight beam cut through the dark like a knife. Max stayed at the door, watching us cautiously. The shadows of the trees looked like looming figures in the light, their long, twisted branches swaying gently in the wind. I felt like I was being watched, but by what? I couldn't tell. We circled the cabin, checking every corner, and found nothing. No broken branches, no signs of someone creeping around. But something still didn't feel right. The feeling was getting worse, like we were intruders in a place that didn't want us there. My heart rate was still elevated, my breath coming in short bursts as I kept scanning the woods. "I don't like this," I muttered under my breath. "I don't either," Jason replied. "Let's head back inside." We made our way back to the cabin, locking the door behind us. Max was standing by the window now, his body tense. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Jason and I sat by the fire again, trying to shake the unease, but it lingered. Every little sound outside made us jump. The wind, the rustling of leaves, and that damned snapping sound. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we decided to call it a night. We both lay down in the room we'd picked out, but sleep didn't come easy. Every small noise had me awake, straining to listen. Max was still at the window, staring out into the night. I finally drifted off, but only for a few hours. The next morning, the sun was just rising, and the world outside was bathed in the soft glow of dawn. I got up, stretched, and walked to the window. The woods looked calm, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of anything strange, no signs of a break-in, no tracks around the cabin. Jason was already up, preparing breakfast. "You sleep okay?" he asked, his voice sounding off. "Not really," I replied. "You?" "Same," he said, shaking his head. "It's like something was watching us all night." I nodded in agreement. It was too hard to ignore. We needed to clear our heads, so we decided to take a hike down the trail we had spotted the day before. Something simple to get our minds off the weird feeling that lingered. Max was excited as usual, running ahead of us, but we kept a close eye on him, just in case. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger. The trees were thicker here, the trail narrower. It felt like the woods were swallowing us whole. About an hour in, we reached a clearing. The place seemed peaceful enough, but then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There, on the far edge of the clearing, was a small structure, another cabin, old and abandoned. The roof was caving in and the walls were nearly falling apart, but it looked like it had been there for years, maybe decades. "That's weird," Jason said, staring at the cabin. "How did we not notice that before?" I had no idea. We hadn't passed it on our way out, and it was too far off the trail for us to have missed. Something about it felt wrong, though, like it had been there too long, forgotten by everyone but nature. "I think we should check it out," Jason suggested, the adventurous part of him taking over. "Are you sure?" I asked, but before he could respond, Max bolted toward the structure, eager as ever. With no other option, we followed. As we neared the cabin, I felt a tightness in my chest. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around and leave, but we were already here. We walked inside the decaying structure. It was dark, the light barely filtering through the cracks in the walls. The air inside smelled stale, musty, like something long abandoned. There was nothing in there but dust and broken furniture, but something felt off. My eyes kept darting to the corners, expecting to see something, someone, and then I saw it. A faint trail of footprints in the dust on the floor. They were fresh, too fresh, and they led toward a trapdoor in the far corner of the room. Jason saw it too, and we exchanged a look. The air had gotten colder. The sense of dread that had been building since we arrived was now impossible to ignore. I glanced at Max. He was sniffing around, acting strangely. He was uneasy, his tail tucked low. Without a word, Jason and I made our way toward the trapdoor. The creaking of the old wood under our feet loud in the otherwise silent cabin. When Jason opened the door, the smell hit us first. It was metallic, like rust, and it made my stomach churn. Below, in the dim light, we could see something that made my blood run cold. Pile of old, rotting things. Clothes, shoes, blankets, and something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. We backed away slowly, but it was too late. The noise of footsteps, rapid and heavy, echoed from behind us. We turned to face whatever or whoever had been watching us from the shadows. Max growled, low and guttural, his hackles raised. A man, covered in dirt, emerged from the woods, his face gaunt and wild, his eyes wide with some twisted kind of madness. He stepped forward, not saying a word, his movements deliberate. I backed away, feeling the weight of the air around us pressing down. There was no escape, no hiding, no reasoning with him. Jason stood his ground, his jaw tight, as the man drew closer. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he turned and ran back into the trees. We didn't wait around. We grabbed Max and ran back down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin, locked the doors, and didn't look back. We left that afternoon as quickly as we could. The rest of the weekend was a blur of nervous energy, but we never returned to that place. As for the man in the woods, we still don't know who he was or why he was out there, but something tells me we were meant to find him. I haven't gone camping since. I was in my late 30s when I took the trip that still haunts me to this day. It was late autumn, the kind of season where the air holds a damp chill, and the days get dark before you realize the afternoon has even passed. I had been meaning to take a break, to get away from the noise and routine of my everyday life. A friend had told me about a remote cabin deep in the countryside of Northumberland, a place nestled among thick woods, far from the nearest town. It sounded perfect. A week of solitude, fresh air, and quiet. The cabin belonged to an older man named Peter, who owned several acres of land. He rented it out to people like me, those who wanted an escape. I had spoken to him briefly when I booked it, and he assured me it was well stocked with firewood and had all the essentials. There was no Wi-Fi, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be disconnected from everything. I arrived just as the last light was slipping away, the sky a dull gray with heavy clouds. The drive had been longer than I expected, the roads narrowing into winding paths flanked by dense forest. By the time I pulled up, the air had turned cold, and the cabin stood in silence among the trees. It was small but sturdy, built of dark, weathered wood. A stone chimney rose from the side, and a small porch wrapped around the front. I killed the engine and stepped out, my boots crunching on the damp ground. The air smelled of earth and distant rain. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way up the steps, the wood creaking beneath me. The key was right where Peter had said it would be, tucked beneath a loose stone by the door. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, with a pile of neatly stacked logs beside it. The furniture was old but well-kept. A small wooden table with 2 chairs, a worn-out couch covered in a thick wool blanket, and a narrow bed against the wall. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its dim glow casting long shadows. I locked the door behind me, set my bag down, and got to work lighting the fire. The cabin was already cold, and the thought of spending the night in freezing temperatures didn't sit well with me. The fire caught quickly, crackling as it began to warm the space. I sat on the couch, stretching out my legs, letting myself relax. The first night was uneventful. I read a book by the fire, cooked a simple meal on the gas stove, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping against the roof. The wind howled through the trees outside, but inside, it was warm and still. It was the second night when things started to feel off. The rain had stopped, but the wind remained, rattling the window panes. I had spent the day exploring the woods, walking along narrow trails, enjoying the quiet. There was no sign of another person for miles, which suited me just fine. By the time I returned, the sky had darkened again, and the wind had picked up. I had just finished eating when I heard something outside, a soft rustling, like footsteps moving through the leaves. I froze, listening. The wind made it hard to tell, but something about the sound felt deliberate, too steady to be the random movement of branches in the breeze. I walked to the window and peered out. The porch light cast a small glow, but beyond that, the forest was nothing but blackness. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes, but there was nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Fox, maybe. There were plenty of those around. Still, I double-checked the lock on the door before heading to bed. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but distinct, like nails dragging against wood. It lasted for only a few seconds before stopping. I stayed completely still, my breath caught in my throat, listening. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I reached for the flashlight by my bed and clicked it on. I wanted to look outside, but something in me hesitated. A deep, instinctive part of my brain screamed at me to stay put. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it to know I was awake. I lay back down, gripping the flashlight, and forced myself to stay still. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The ground was damp, covered in scattered leaves, but nothing seemed disturbed. I walked around the cabin, looking for anything out of place. Then I saw them, faint but unmistakable. There were footprints leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin wall. They weren't deep, suggesting whoever made them had been light on their feet. The prints stopped just beneath my bedroom window. I felt a cold chill creep over me. Someone had been here last night. I spent the rest of the day on edge, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had wandered too close, but that made no sense. Who would be hiking out here in the middle of the night? By evening, the unease had settled deep into my bones. I kept the fire going, the warmth doing little to push away the growing tension. Every so often, I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see something staring back. Then, around midnight, I saw her. I had been lying on the couch, unable to sleep, when I caught movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the shadows shifting in the wind. But then I saw her clearly. A woman stood just beyond the porch, barely visible in the dim glow. She was facing the cabin, standing completely still. Her clothes were dark and loose, blending with the night. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. I didn't move. I barely breathed. She didn't knock, didn't say a word. She just stood there, her posture rigid, as if she was listening. Minutes passed. I couldn't bring myself to look away. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my bag with shaking hands. When I stepped onto the porch, my breath caught. More footprints, leading from the woods to the cabin, leading from the window to the door. I didn't waste another second. I threw my bag into the car, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I never went back, never told Peter what happened. I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I know one thing for certain. She had been watching me. I don't know why I agreed to go. It's not like I needed the extra push, but something about the whole thing made it feel inevitable. A few days before, I'd been working my usual routine, keeping things simple in the city, work, home, the occasional drink with friends. But when my cousin, Ben, called about this old cabin up in the mountains, I didn't even hesitate. Ben's a bit of a wild card. He's been in the Army for nearly 10 years, and after his last deployment, he seemed a little off. He'd been talking about wanting to get away from the noise, escape everything for a while, and this cabin, he said, was the perfect place. No phones, no distractions, just the woods. His voice had this urgency to it, like he was asking for something more than just company. The cabin was in the mountains of West Virginia, about a 5-hour drive from where I live. It was the kind of place you'd never expect to find a cell tower anywhere near. The kind of place where people went to get lost and not be found again. It had been in the family for a while, passed down from some distant relative who'd built it during the Depression. The house was basic, small, and square, but sturdy. Not much more than a shell of old wood and a cracked chimney. The roof had seen better days, and the paint on the exterior was long gone. But that didn't matter much to Ben. He'd grown up there, spent weekends hunting with his father, and he always talked about it as though the cabin was some sort of sanctuary, a place that didn't judge you or ask questions. So, there I was, driving up the winding, narrow road through the forest, my headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the landscape. I had only been up to the cabin once or twice when we were kids, and every time we'd gone, it had felt like a piece of forgotten history, isolated, tucked away, and surrounded by an endless stretch of trees. Ben hadn't given me much of a heads up. He just said he'd been up there for a few days to clear his head and would be waiting for me. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing that hit me was the silence. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive stillness. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin. The windows were dark. No smoke came from the chimney. Felt like no one had been there in days. Stepping out of the truck, I grabbed my gear, nothing more than a backpack and a couple of duffel bags, and made my way to the front door. It creaked open with a hesitant push, the wood protesting with age. Inside, it smelled like old pine and damp earth. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of the woods outside and the faint, musty odor of things left too long undisturbed. Ben, I called, but my voice only echoed through the hollow, empty space. I walked through the small cabin, checking each room, but there was no sign of him. The living area was barely furnished. An old couch, a couple of chairs, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a small table with mismatched chairs around it. Felt abandoned in the worst way. No signs of life, no personal touches, just the starkness of a place that had long ago given up on being a home. I dropped my bags by the door, wondering where he was. Maybe he'd gone for a walk, I thought, or taken off into the woods for some space. But as the hours passed, the unsettling quietness only seemed to grow. The wind started picking up outside, rattling the windows, and the shadows seemed to stretch further into the cabin, making it feel even smaller, more cramped. The evening came quickly, and I decided to start a fire. The logs were stacked outside, ready to go. I gathered some kindling and, with the skill I'd picked up over the years, managed to get a small flame going. The heat was a relief, but it didn't chase away the unease creeping through my mind. I spent the next couple of hours pacing around the cabin, checking the doors and windows, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. But by the time the sun set and the shadows took full hold of the cabin, I knew that I wasn't alone. I heard a faint rustling sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and just outside the cabin. I froze, straining my ears, but nothing. The sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and stood still for a moment, trying to calm myself. Could have been a deer, a raccoon, or anything. There were plenty of animals out there, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something felt off, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I pulled on my jacket and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the yard. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the trees, the porch, and the tall grass at the edge of the clearing. There was nothing but the usual quiet hum of the night, crickets, distant rustling, and the occasional branch creaking in the wind. I stepped back into the cabin, my nerves still on edge. The fire was starting to die down, and I added a few more logs to the stove. As I sat down on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking the windows. I felt exposed, alone, like the woods were closing in on me. Then I heard it again, the rustling sound, this time closer, much closer, and then a knock on the door. I froze. The knock was faint at first, almost hesitant, but then louder, more urgent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly stood, my legs shaking. I didn't know what to do. Should I open it? Should I check the porch? My heart was pounding in my chest, the fear settling deep in my bones. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this vulnerable, this exposed. Then I heard Ben's voice. "I'm back," he said, but it didn't sound like Ben. The voice was lower, raspier, and had a strange echo to it. It didn't sound like him at all. I moved toward the door, hand hovering over the knob, my mind racing. It wasn't like Ben to act this way. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I didn't open the door. Instead, I grabbed a fire poker from beside the stove and held it tight in my hand. There was no way I was opening that door without knowing who was on the other side. The voice called out again, this time with a slight tremor, like it was losing patience. "I need help," it said, but I didn't move. I stood still, listening to the footsteps retreating, and then nothing. I waited for what felt like hours. The fear in me kept growing, squeezing tight, but there was no sound, no movement, nothing. I wasn't about to open that door, not after what I'd heard. Instead, I gathered my things, made sure the windows were locked, and waited through the night, clutching the poker. The hours crawled by, but no one came back. No more knocking, no more voices. In the morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't wait for Ben any longer. I drove out of there, shaking from the cold and the unease, not sure what to think about what had happened. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. I was supposed to be on vacation. That's what I told my sister when she handed me the map to a small, secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. It had been a rough few months after my last job. Things hadn't gone well, and I was desperate to get away from the noise of the city. Somewhere quiet, somewhere I could just breathe. The cabin was supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be a getaway. But when I arrived, things felt off. The place sat tucked away in the dense woods of northern Ontario. I hadn't seen another soul since the last little town I passed through, nearly an hour back. I drove up the winding gravel road, surrounded by towering trees and the faint scent of pine in the air. The cabin itself wasn't much. Rustic, old, and isolated. A single-story structure made from weathered wood, with a slanted roof and a small porch at the front. The windows were covered in grime, and the door looked like it had been repaired a dozen times. It didn't seem like much, but that's why I was there, to get away from everything. As I approached, a knot tightened in my stomach. It wasn't the place that unsettled me, though. It was the feeling. Something was wrong. It didn't make sense. My gut told me to turn around and leave, but I was too stubborn for that. I wanted to see it through. I had to. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and made my way up the creaky steps. The door was already slightly ajar, which struck me as odd, but I figured it was just from the wind or animals messing around. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside smelled stale. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and dust filled the air as I moved further in. There were a few old chairs, a worn-out couch, and a table with mismatched chairs around it. A wood-burning stove sat in one corner, the black iron looking cold and unused. The place was barren except for a few random items. Old fishing gear, what appeared to be a rifle leaning against the wall, and some crates stacked in the corner. Something caught my eye, a faint, sticky residue on the floor near the far wall, as if something had been dragged across it. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. This was supposed to be my retreat, after all. I set my bag down, walked over to the window, and peered outside. The view was breathtaking. A vast stretch of forest surrounded the cabin, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching over everything. But in the distance, I could make out something odd. A figure, just standing there. It was a man. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and seemed to be staring right at the cabin. He didn't move, just stood there in the shadow of the trees. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the moment I did, the figure disappeared behind the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the afternoon getting the cabin settled. I found a few cans of food in the cupboard, a half-full bottle of water, and some blankets. Nothing fancy. I wasn't here for luxury, just solitude. But I kept thinking about that man. Who was he? What was he doing out there? As night began to fall, the woods seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The sounds of branches scraping against the roof and distant animal calls filled the air. But there was something else in the mix, a low hum almost like machinery. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it wasn't normal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I figured it was probably just the wind, the isolation playing tricks on me. I lit the stove, made a small fire, and settled down on the couch with a book. But every now and then, I would hear something that made me stop and listen. A creak from the far side of the cabin, the sound of footsteps on the porch, a soft tap at the window. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time it was a knock, faint but unmistakable. At the door, I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I stayed silent, waiting to see if it was just my imagination. The knock came again, this time a bit louder. And then the voice. "Hey, you there?" The voice was low and gruff, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't from a normal person. I didn't answer. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I wasn't armed, I didn't have a phone signal, and I was isolated. I heard the voice again, this time closer to the window. "I know you're in there. Open up." I gripped the edge of the couch, trying to steady my breathing. I was alone in a cabin, and some stranger was on my doorstep, demanding to be let in. I wasn't stupid. I knew better than to open the door. I stayed still, as quiet as I could, hoping they'd just go away. But I could hear them moving around the outside of the cabin. The soft shuffle of feet on the dirt and gravel. They weren't leaving. My thoughts raced. What could they want? Was this some sort of smuggling operation? Was I in the middle of something dangerous? I couldn't just sit here and wait to find out. I grabbed the rifle I had noticed earlier. Felt heavy in my hands. It wasn't loaded, but that didn't matter. I needed to make sure I wasn't walking into a trap. I crept to the door, slowly, carefully. I peeked through the cracked blinds, but all I saw was the dark outline of the trees. The figure was gone. I waited for what felt like hours. The night dragged on, and the sounds of the forest continued, but there was no sign of the stranger. I could feel my heart racing, but I didn't dare leave the cabin to check. What if they were still out there? What if there were more of them? Around 3 a.m., exhaustion took over. I collapsed on the couch, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind sent my heart into overdrive. I kept the rifle close, my hands clutched around it, as if it could protect me from whatever was out there. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The sun rose slowly over the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin. I grabbed my things, made sure everything was locked up tight, and decided it was time to leave. As I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something in the dirt. It was a footprint, large, heavy, and fresh. Whoever had been outside last night was still out there. I didn't stick around to investigate. I grabbed my keys and ran for the car. I didn't care if I had to drive through the night. I wasn't staying another second in that cabin. As I sped down the winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me drive away. But when I blinked, they were gone. I had been working long hours, and the stress was beginning to wear on me. The city was loud, crowded, and relentless. I needed time away, time to be alone with my thoughts, to let the silence settle over me like a heavy blanket. So when a friend mentioned a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, I didn't hesitate. It was late autumn, and the days were growing shorter. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, barely a road at all, just dirt and gravel that crunched under my tires. The trees on either side of me loomed tall, their branches nearly blocking out the overcast sky. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization beyond the occasional worn-out hunting shack or rusted mailbox. I had rented the cabin for a week, planning to spend my days hiking, reading, and just existing without the constant pressure of deadlines and expectations. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as my friend had described: small, sturdy, and old. It sat at the edge of a clearing, its wooden walls weathered and dark from years of exposure. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, and a single window near the door reflected the dimming light of the sky. There was no running water, no electricity, just a wood-burning stove, a few oil lamps, and an old-fashioned hand pump for drawing water from a well out back. I parked my truck a few feet from the front steps and got out, stretching my legs as I took in the quiet. The silence was overwhelming. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no planes overhead. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches rubbing together. Felt good, peaceful. I spent the first evening settling in. The inside of the cabin was simple but comfortable. Wooden furniture, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a single bed in the corner. There were shelves lined with old books, a hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, and a stack of neatly cut firewood beside the stove. I made a quick meal, lit an oil lamp, and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest as darkness took over. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The kind of sleep that pulls you under, heavy and dreamless. But something woke me before dawn, a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, I realized it was something else. A slow, deliberate creaking, like weight shifting on the porch boards. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again. Not the wind, not an animal. Something heavy, something moving. I sat up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The cabin had no curtains, and through the window, I could see nothing but blackness. I reached for the flashlight I had left on the nightstand, clicked it on, and shone it toward the front door. Nothing, just the empty porch. The sound had stopped. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was just the house settling, the old wood shifting in the cold night air. But I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. The next day, I convinced myself I had imagined it. I spent the morning chopping wood, taking long walks through the trees, and clearing my mind. The day passed without incident, and by the time the sun set, I felt more at ease. But that night, the sound returned. A slow, deliberate creak, then another, and another. Someone or something was walking on the porch. This time, I didn't move. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. The steps were slow, almost hesitant. They stopped just outside the door. I strained my ears, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning came, gray and cold. I stepped outside, scanning the ground, but the porch was empty. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance. I tried to shake it off, but an unease settled deep in my chest. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, I saw something, a figure just at the edge of the woods, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't an animal. It was a man, standing still, watching. A cold fear curled around my spine. I stood, my breath coming fast, my mind racing. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. Then, slowly, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had rented the cabin for a week. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded my bag into the truck, double-checked that I had everything, and climbed into the driver's seat. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Just a hollow click. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Nothing. Popping the hood, I checked the battery, the connections. Everything seemed fine, but the truck wouldn't start. The fear that had been a dull ache in my chest now clawed its way into full-blown panic. I was stranded. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no choice but to walk. Grabbing my backpack, I started down the road, moving fast, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The air was cold, the wind sharp against my skin. Every crunch of my boots on the gravel sounded deafening in the quiet. I had been walking for nearly an hour when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I turned, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Just the empty road stretching behind me, the trees swaying in the wind. Quickened my pace. The footsteps followed. Faster now. Closer. Then, ahead of me, a figure stepped onto the road. The man from the woods. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. He stood there, blocking my path, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. And then I heard it, more footsteps. From behind. I was surrounded. I didn't think. I ran, darting into the trees, branches slashing at my face, my lungs burning. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Eventually, I found a road, a real road, and a truck. A passing driver who slowed when they saw me, breathless, wide-eyed, waving them down. I never went back for my truck, never went back to that cabin. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, but I know one thing: I wasn't supposed to leave that place alive. It was late autumn when I drove out to the cabin. The days had gotten shorter, and the chill in the air was enough to make you layer up before you even considered stepping outside. My cousin, Alex, had been working as a cop for a few years by then, and he'd invited me out to the cabin he had just inherited from an old uncle of ours. The place was tucked away in the woods, isolated from the world, the kind of place you'd never find unless you knew exactly where to look. Alex and I weren't close growing up, but we'd reconnected in the last couple of years. We'd both moved away from our hometown, me for work and him for his career in law enforcement. But something about the cabin intrigued me. I needed a break, and I thought a weekend in the woods with Alex could be the perfect way to unwind. I arrived just before dusk. The cabin was exactly what I expected. A small, wooden structure nestled between the tall pines. It wasn't luxurious, but it had that rustic charm. A porch with a couple of chairs, windows covered by old wooden shutters, and a chimney with a few wisps of smoke drifting out, signaling that the place was indeed being lived in. The long driveway leading to the cabin was rough, full of potholes and overgrown with weeds. It felt like nobody had cared much for it in years, and that gave it a certain eerie feel. I parked my car and grabbed my bag from the trunk. The air was cold and biting, and I could hear the rustle of the wind through the trees. The woods around the cabin were dense, and it seemed like the trees were closing in on me the farther I walked. I could feel the isolation in my bones as I made my way to the porch. Alex greeted me with a warm smile. He was tall, built like someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. His uniform was gone, replaced by casual clothes that looked like they'd seen a lot of miles. There was something in his eyes, though, that unsettled me. It was as if he was holding something back, something he didn't want to talk about. "Glad you could make it," Alex said, clapping me on the shoulder. "It's quiet out here, but I think you'll like it." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As we walked into the cabin, I noticed the inside was just as rustic as the outside, but it had a certain charm to it. There was an old stone fireplace in the corner, a couple of comfortable-looking chairs, a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and a staircase that led up to a loft. The cabin had a lived-in feel, but not a homey one, more like a place that had been used and abandoned and then used again. We settled in for the night, and Alex made us dinner. We ate in silence, the only sounds coming from the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. As the evening went on, I started to relax, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was like the trees outside were listening, the air around us too still. After dinner, Alex offered me the guest room. It was small, with just a bed and a dresser, but the room was clean. I didn't think much of it as I changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed. The wood of the cabin creaked as the wind picked up outside. I pulled the blankets up around my shoulders and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. Something had disturbed me, a noise in the distance. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder. A thud, then another. It sounded like something heavy being dropped or dragged. My heart started pounding. I lay there, listening, straining to hear over the sound of my own breath. The noises continued, getting closer. Thud, thud, thud. I jumped out of bed, my mind racing. I knew Alex would hear it too. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, that wasn't surprising. This was a remote cabin in the woods, after all. I felt my way to the door, trying to be quiet, but the floorboards creaked under my feet. I peeked out into the hall, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard Alex. His door opened. He was standing there in the dim light of the hallway, his face tight with worry. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't answer right away, but I could see the tension in his posture. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay inside. I'll check it out," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. I watched as he grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and slipped out into the night, leaving me alone in the cabin. I felt exposed, like I was waiting for something to happen, something I couldn't understand. The wind howled outside, and the trees seemed to sway in rhythm with my heartbeat. I stood by the window, watching for any sign of movement, but all I could see was darkness. The shadows stretched far into the woods. The minutes stretched on. I kept telling myself Alex would be fine. He was a cop. He knew what he was doing. But the longer he was gone, the more I began to worry. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to push it aside, but my mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there, just beyond the reach of the light. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was someone who shouldn't be there? Suddenly, the door to the cabin burst open, and Alex stormed in. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. He didn't say anything as he slammed the door behind him and locked it. "Alex?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just stood there, panting, his hand gripping the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping him from falling. "What happened?" I pressed, my pulse quickening. He finally looked at me, his face contorting with fear. "Someone's out there. I don't know who, but they're not alone." I couldn't see them clearly, but I heard voices, and they were talking about us. I froze. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, about us?" Alex shook his head, taking a step back. "We need to leave. Now." He started grabbing things from around the cabin, his movements frantic. I didn't know what to do. Should I trust him? Was this just some bad luck? Or were we really in danger? The cabin was quiet again, too quiet, and that's when I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. There was someone outside. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. The tapping continued, rhythmic, deliberate. "Get down," Alex hissed, pulling me to the floor. We stayed low, our breathing shallow. I could hear the person on the other side of the window moving around, scratching at the glass. Then, a low voice, barely audible, whispered something I couldn't understand. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a loud crash from the back of the cabin. Someone had forced the door open. Alex and I scrambled to the kitchen, looking for something to defend ourselves with. My hands shook as I grabbed a butcher knife, while Alex grabbed a heavy pan from the stove. We crouched behind the counter, waiting, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the cabin. Whoever was out there was taking their time. The door to the kitchen swung open, and there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. He wasn't alone. There were two others behind him, their faces obscured by shadows. The man didn't speak, but I could see the glint of something in his hand. A knife, just like mine. Alex stepped forward, brandishing the pan, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't something he could handle with his badge. I took a deep breath, readying myself. This was it. We had no choice now. Either we fought or we didn't make it out of here alive. The man lunged at us, and in that moment, everything went into slow motion. The world narrowed down to the sound of my heartbeat and the movement of the knife. I swung the butcher knife with everything I had, catching the man's arm. He recoiled, stumbling back. The others closed in, but Alex hit one with the pan, knocking him out cold. I heard the third man shout something, but it didn't matter. We were too quick. In a blur of adrenaline, the three men were subdued. Alex called the police, his voice shaking. It wasn't long before backup arrived. The men were arrested, but we never found out who they were or why they were there. The authorities couldn't trace them to anyone we knew, and it remained one of those strange, unexplainable things that kept gnawing at me. After everything settled down, we packed up and left the cabin. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods held more secrets than I would ever know. But at least we were safe. That's the only thing that mattered in the end. The rain had been coming down in sheets, heavy and constant, for what felt like days. I wasn't used to it, even though I had spent so many years in the woods. The quiet of the forest was unsettling, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the cabin as the wind rattled the old timbers. It felt like everything in this place was creaking with age. I was alone now, just like I had been for the last year, since the divorce. It wasn't supposed to be this way. This cabin, tucked away on the edge of the woods, had been a place of comfort, a getaway. After the separation, though, I felt the weight of it in every corner. Every inch of this cabin held memories I wasn't sure I could bear. And yet, I had come here again, hoping the isolation would give me some kind of peace. I had rented the place for the weekend, telling myself I needed a break from the chaos of city life. But what I hadn't fully acknowledged was how the silence of the forest could feel like a suffocating thing when you're alone with your thoughts. I had done everything to avoid being here alone after the split. The place used to feel so full of life, of laughter, of conversations, but now it felt hollow. The cabin was small, weathered wood inside and out, a fireplace in the center of the living room, a small kitchen to the side. A modest porch with a couple of chairs looked out over the dense woods that went on for miles. There was a small creek behind the cabin that I could hear trickling faintly when the rain wasn't too heavy. I tried to keep myself busy. It was too easy to spiral into thoughts I didn't want to face. So I cooked a simple dinner, cleaned up after myself, and went out to the porch to watch the storm. The woods were thick, dark shadows between the trees, the mist rolling low to the ground. The rain didn't stop. It seemed like the kind of storm that wouldn't end, just like the emptiness that had filled me since the divorce. Sitting there, I started thinking back to how I had ended up here, to the mistakes I had made, the broken promises, the arguments, the silence that had settled between us in the final months. I never thought I'd be in this situation. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, not a reminder of what had gone wrong. It was then that I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a trick of the rain, but there it was again. A noise in the woods, a rustling, something moving between the trees. It was strange, too deliberate for an animal, too heavy for the breeze. My heart started beating faster, though I tried to reason with myself. It was probably just a deer or some other animal, though the thought didn't comfort me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had spent enough time in these woods to know what was out there, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was out there. A few minutes passed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the tension in my chest only grew. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't sure why it made me feel safer, but it did. The rain started to come down even harder, the storm growing more intense by the minute. I moved to the window to see if I could make out anything outside. The trees were blurred by the downpour, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving past the edge of the cabin. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to reason with myself. It was just my imagination, surely. But then it happened again. A figure, too large to be an animal, passed in front of the window. I felt my pulse quicken, my mouth dry. No, it couldn't be. There was no one out there. But as the minutes dragged on, the unease in my stomach twisted tighter. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was out there. I moved to the back door, looking out into the darkness, the rain and wind making it nearly impossible to see anything clearly. Still, I waited. There was something in the air, something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to open the door just a crack. The rain hit my face immediately, cold and stinging, but I didn't care. I needed to know. I stepped outside, trying to keep my footing on the slippery steps, my breath coming in short bursts as I moved towards the edge of the woods. The air was thick with moisture, and the wind whipped through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. I kept walking, scanning the area. My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't stop. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. As I neared the line of trees, I froze. There, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight, was a figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing completely still. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I could feel his eyes on me, even from this distance. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but all that came out was a shallow breath. The man didn't move either, just standing there, like he was waiting for something. I didn't know how long we stood there, locked in that silent standoff, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, he turned, slowly, and began walking away, disappearing into the trees. My body shook with adrenaline, but I couldn't bring myself to follow him. What if he wasn't alone? What if this was all part of something worse? I didn't know. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me. I bolted the locks again, then slid to the floor, my hands shaking. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. The man, or whatever he was, had been real. He had been out there, waiting. But for what? I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for much longer than I realized. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I had been imagining things. The storm, the darkness, the isolation, they had all played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. It had been real. The night dragged on. The storm raged, the rain pouring harder than ever. I stayed inside, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, checking the locks, hoping that whatever it was would just go away. I didn't sleep, couldn't. The images of that man haunted me, but even more than that, I was terrified of what would happen if I left this place. Would I be safe? Would I run into him again? By the morning, the storm had begun to die down, the rain easing into a gentle drizzle. The world outside was still and quiet, like everything had been washed clean. I packed my things quickly, hardly daring to look out the window as I drove away from the cabin. The woods stretched on in every direction, empty and desolate. I didn't look back, but I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. Instead, I felt a strange sense of finality. The man, or whatever he was, had been a warning. A reminder that sometimes the things we fear aren't just in our heads. They're real and they're out there watching us. And now I was free. Free from the cabin, free from the memories that had haunted me for so long. But I couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, the cabin had been the last chapter of my past. It had been a place where everything fell apart, and now it was where I left it all behind. But I couldn't forget the man in the woods, and part of me wondered, did I really leave him behind? The rain had stopped, but I wasn't sure I'd ever feel fully safe again. The air was crisp as I made my way down the winding, dirt road that led to the old cabin. It had been years since I last visited, but something about this place always drew me in. The cabin was tucked away deep in the French countryside, miles from the nearest town. I had planned to stay for just a weekend, a chance to escape the noise of city life and clear my head. Little did I know that my visit would turn into a nightmare that I would never forget. The sun was beginning to set as I reached the cabin, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass that surrounded the small structure. It looked exactly as I remembered, the wooden exterior weathered by time, the roof covered in moss. The cabin had always had a certain charm, but today, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the place seemed colder, darker than I remembered. I shrugged off the feeling as nothing more than the effects of being alone in the woods. I had grown up here, spending weekends with my father, and later on my own, as a way to escape the stresses of everyday life. But today, the silence was heavier than usual. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if the entire forest had fallen still, holding its breath. I grabbed my bag from the back of the car and walked up the steps to the front porch. The door creaked open with ease, revealing the same simple interior that had greeted me countless times before. A small fireplace sat to the left, with a stack of wood neatly arranged beside it. The furniture was old but sturdy, with a few worn rugs scattered across the hardwood floor. I set my bag down on the bed in the corner and began to unpack, telling myself that the unease I felt was just a product of my imagination. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching as the last remnants of sunlight faded from the sky. The forest outside looked serene, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Night fell quickly, and with it came the sounds of the forest. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees and sending occasional gusts of air through the cracks in the cabin's walls. But even with the wind howling outside, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I had stayed here many times before without incident. But tonight felt different. The shadows seemed to move with a mind of their own, creeping into every corner of the cabin. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be standing behind me. I tried to ignore the feeling, settling in for the night. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth providing some comfort in the otherwise cold room. I picked up a book and tried to focus on the words, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange sensations I couldn't shake. The wind outside howled louder now, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving in the trees. It was faint at first, but as the minutes passed, it grew clearer, closer. I set the book down, straining my ears to listen. There was definitely something out there. The sounds were too deliberate, too purposeful to be just the wind. My heart began to race. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there and they were moving closer. I stood up from the chair, my legs unsteady as I approached the door. Slowly, I reached for the handle and cracked it open, peering into the darkness. The night was thick, the shadows impenetrable, but I could just make out the outline of the trees surrounding the cabin. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I stepped back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My breath was coming in short gasps now, my pulse pounding in my ears. What was happening? I couldn't explain it, but I knew something wasn't right. The sound of footsteps broke the silence again. This time, they were unmistakable, heavy, and deliberate. Someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the cabin's lights. I grabbed the old rifle that had been hanging above the fireplace, a relic from my father's time. It wasn't loaded, but the weight of it in my hands gave me a sense of security, even if only a small one. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm waiting to break. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I stood frozen, the rifle still in my hands, my eyes darting around the room. What the hell was going on? Was I losing my mind? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the front door, followed by a series of rapid knocks. I jumped back, the rifle clattering to the floor as I stumbled backward. My heart was hammering in my chest. Who could it be? No one ever came to this cabin. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there was no one else around for miles. The knocks came again, more urgent this time. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I open the door? Should I call for help? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. There was no way I was going to open the door without knowing who was on the other side. I grabbed my phone, only to find that there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, far from any cell towers. I moved silently toward the window, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was outside. My breath fogged up the glass as I pressed my face to it, peering into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, just outside the cabin's light. A man, tall and thin, with a hood pulled low over his face. He stood still, as if waiting for something, his figure blending into the darkness around him. My heart skipped a beat. What did he want? Why was he here? I stepped back from the window, my hands shaking. I needed to think. I couldn't just stand here and wait. I had to do something. I picked up the rifle again, loaded it as best as I could, and moved toward the door. My mind raced as I tried to come up with a plan, but every option seemed to lead to more danger. The man outside didn't move. He simply stood there, as though he were watching the cabin, waiting for me to make a move. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of the old wood. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I decided to act. I grabbed a flashlight from the table, shining it out the window to get a better look at the man. He didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed to take a step closer, his face still hidden beneath the hood. The fear I had felt earlier began to turn into something else, something more primal. I didn't know if he was dangerous or not, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I had to get out of here. I turned away from the window and grabbed my bag, quickly throwing together anything I could carry. The man outside wasn't the only threat. I could feel the weight of the darkness closing in around me, the weight of the isolation pressing down harder with every passing second. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what he wanted. I grabbed the keys to my car and ran outside, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted toward the vehicle. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car roared to life. I threw it into gear and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of the man in the woods, of the strange feeling that had plagued me since I arrived, of the isolation that had become suffocating. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, my hands still shaking as I pulled into a gas station. I had no idea what had happened at the cabin, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to find out. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going back there again. The rain started as a slow drizzle, the kind that gets under your skin and chills you from the inside out. I had just finished my last day of work for the week and was headed up to the cabin at Stone Creek. It was a small place, tucked away in a remote part of the woods, far from the nearest neighbor. A friend of mine, Robert, had told me about it a few months ago. He said it was a perfect spot to unwind, peaceful, quiet, and far from the chaos of city life. He wasn't wrong about the quiet part, at least. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed there. In fact, I'd made the trip a few times over the past couple of years. The cabin was small, just one room with a stone fireplace and a loft where the bed was tucked away. No electricity, no running water, but it was enough for me. There was something calming about the isolation, even if the thought of it made my mind wander to places I didn't want it to go. Sometimes, when you're alone in a place like that, you start to hear things, the wind rustling through the trees, the creaking of the wood. You never know if it's the wind or something else. The road up to the cabin was narrow, winding, and barely visible through the thick trees. The rain had turned the dirt path into a slippery mess, but I was used to it by now. My truck had seen worse roads. It was about a 45-minute drive from the nearest town, a place called Cedar Hollow. The people there were friendly enough, but the town was small and mostly forgotten. The locals didn't seem to mind the isolation. Some of them thrived on it, even. I pulled up in front of the cabin just as the rain picked up, the wind howling through the trees. The familiar sight of the cabin, its wooden walls weathered from years of exposure to the elements, gave me a strange sense of relief. I got out of the truck, grabbed my bag, and walked up to the door. The key was still hidden under the same loose stone near the door frame, just like Robert had told me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, shaking off the wet from my coat. The air inside was cool but dry, and the smell of old wood and musty earth hit me immediately. It was a comforting scent, one that reminded me of simpler times. I tossed my bag onto the small table by the door and went to start a fire in the hearth. The wood was stacked neatly in the corner, and I was grateful for that. It was always a little difficult to get the fire going when you had to chop the wood yourself. Once the fire was crackling, I unpacked my things and settled into a chair by the fire. I'd brought a couple of books with me, as well as a bottle of whiskey to help pass the time. I wasn't expecting any company, and I preferred it that way. I liked the solitude, the way it allowed me to think clearly without distractions. Nightfall came quickly, and the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The rain was now coming down in sheets, slapping against the windows with a steady rhythm. I sat there, staring into the flames, my mind wandering. It wasn't until I heard the first knock that I snapped out of my trance. It was a soft knock, barely audible over the storm. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, 2 short taps, followed by a longer pause. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, walking cautiously toward the door. Who could be out here, especially in this weather? I wasn't expecting anyone. Robert had mentioned something about checking in on the cabin, but he wouldn't show up unannounced like this. I peeked through the small window next to the door, but saw nothing but darkness and rain. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door, my hand gripping the handle with a tightness I hadn't expected. When I pulled it open, there was no one there. The porch was empty, just wet planks of wood slick with rain. I stepped outside, looking around, but there was nothing. The cold wind whipped against my skin as I stood on the porch, scanning the trees. My breath fogged in the air, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was then that I heard it, a soft shuffle from the woods just beyond the cabin. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but the sound was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate shuffle, like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. Whoever it was moving closer. I wanted to call out, ask if they needed help, but something about the situation felt wrong. No one should be out here in this weather, especially not this close to the cabin. I closed the door slowly, locking it behind me. I stood there, my back pressed against the wood, listening. The shuffling stopped for a moment, and then there was a soft thud, a body slumping against the side of the cabin. I felt a chill run down my spine. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I didn't know what to do. The idea of going out there, confronting whoever or whatever was out there seemed like the worst decision I could make. But staying inside, waiting, didn't feel safe either. I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag and shone it out the window, scanning the area around the cabin. Nothing. The light bounced off the wet ground, the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. The shuffle had stopped, and now the only sound was the wind and the rain. I kept the flashlight trained on the trees, my hand trembling. I was about to step back when I saw something. A figure barely visible standing just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its presence. An eerie stillness in the air. I backed away from the window, my heart thumping in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't leaving, and they weren't alone. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was it someone lost in the storm? Someone in trouble? Or something else entirely? The rain didn't let up that night. In fact, it only grew worse, the howling wind filling the cabin with an oppressive weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. As I sat there in front of the fire, my mind racing, I heard another knock, this time more insistent, louder. 3 sharp raps. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there and I had to find out what it was. I grabbed a large knife from the small kitchen and cautiously approached the door. My breath was shallow, my palms sweaty as I turned the knob, opening it just enough to peer outside. The figure was still there, standing motionless in the rain. I couldn't see their face, just a dark shape in the night. My mind screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stepped outside, the cold rain soaking through my clothes instantly, but I didn't care. I had to know who this was. As I got closer, the figure finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward me. The face that I saw was unfamiliar, weathered and dirty, with deep lines etched into the skin. His eyes were hollow, dark circles under them, and his expression was unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't move a muscle beyond the slow shift of his head. I stood there, frozen, as the storm raged around us. The figure didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. I stood there for a long time, my body stiff with fear, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a person? A wanderer, maybe? Or something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something dangerous, something sinister. The rest of the night passed without incident. The rain finally stopped, and the storm cleared, leaving the world outside wet and silent. I didn't sleep a wink that night, but when morning came, I packed up my things and left the cabin behind, not looking back. I never went back to Stone Creek, and I never found out who or what was out there that night. But sometimes, when the wind picks up and the trees start to sway, I still think about the figure in the woods, and I wonder if it was just a man lost in the storm, or if something else was watching me that night. It was just another quiet night in the woods. At least that's how it seemed when I first arrived. My cabin sat nestled on the edge of a dense, dark forest in the remote part of Oregon. It was a small, modest structure, weathered from years of rain, wind, and snow. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air as I pulled up in my truck, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I didn't expect much. It was just me, the cabin, and the sound of the rain. No one else for miles. I'd been looking forward to a weekend of solitude, escaping the chaos of everyday life. The last few months had been rough. Work had been relentless, and I just needed time to clear my head. This cabin was supposed to be the perfect getaway. It was isolated, quiet, and the kind of place where you could forget about the world and its demands. As I got out of the truck, the rain started coming down harder, a relentless, steady pour that soaked my clothes almost instantly. The chill of the night air bit into my skin, making me pull my jacket tighter around me. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and headed inside, shaking the water off my boots as I crossed the threshold. The inside was exactly how I remembered it. Simple, rustic, but comfortable enough. There was a small kitchen off to the left, a living area with a fireplace that hadn't been used in ages, and a small wooden table in the corner. I tossed my bag onto the couch and went to start a fire. The wood was damp, but I managed to get a small flame going after a few tries. The crackling of the fire was soothing, and the warmth started to spread through the room, cutting through the damp chill. I spent the next few hours relaxing, reading a book by the firelight. The rain outside intensified, tapping against the windows with a steady rhythm. The occasional gust of wind would rattle the trees, but otherwise it was calm. I didn't expect any company, nor did I want any. The solitude was exactly what I needed. It wasn't until late in the evening that I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The cabin was surrounded by thick trees, and with the storm outside, the shadows were deep and shifting. But as I sat there, staring into the fire, I thought I saw something moving outside the window, a dark figure, just at the edge of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was just the wind or a trick of the rain. Maybe a deer or some other animal had wandered too close to the cabin. I didn't think much of it, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out, but there was nothing. Just the rain, the trees, and the soft glow of the cabin lights. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid and returned to my book. The fire crackled on, and the storm outside seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. It was the kind of storm that made you feel small, like the world outside was closing in on you. But I wasn't scared. Not yet, anyway. Then, about an hour later, I heard it. A soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who would be out here in this weather? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen another car on the road for days. My first thought was that it was someone in trouble, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost or someone who needed help. But then I remembered something. There were no hiking trails around here. No one ever came this far. I sat there, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood up, slowly, not making a sound. I tiptoed to the window and peeked outside, but there was nothing. No one. I didn't move for a while, just listening to the rain, the wind, and the quiet. There was no sound of footsteps, no signs of anyone being outside, just the pounding of the storm. I debated what to do. Should I open the door? Was it someone playing a trick on me? Or was it something else? I decided to stay put, my nerves on edge. The knocking stopped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I sat back down by the fire, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on my book. But the words didn't make sense anymore, and every time I glanced toward the door, my stomach twisted with dread. It wasn't until I heard the sound again, this time from the back of the cabin, that I knew something wasn't right. A faint scraping noise, like fingers dragging along wood. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The back door was locked as far as I knew, but I hadn't been outside in hours. Could have been the wind, the trees creaking, but the sound felt deliberate. I moved cautiously toward the back of the cabin, keeping low, listening intently. The scraping stopped just as I reached the door, and the silence that followed was deafening. My hand was sweaty on the door handle, and for a moment, I hesitated, but something pushed me forward. Curiosity, fear, I didn't know, but I opened the door just a crack. The rain was coming down harder now, and I could barely see anything in the darkness. I stepped outside, my feet sinking into the soft mud as I walked around the cabin. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. The wind howled through the trees, and I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me. I returned inside, double-locked the door, and sat back down by the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my eyes darted nervously around the room. Hours passed, the fire slowly dying down to embers. The storm showed no signs of letting up. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay in this cabin any longer. I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and rushed out the door. There was no way I was staying here tonight. But as I reached the truck, something caught my eye. A shadow moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. My heart slammed against my chest as I watched, frozen in place. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly, deliberately, as though they knew I was watching. And then they stopped. The figure turned toward the cabin, and I saw them clearly for the first time. A tall, thin man dressed in dark clothing. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and he didn't make a sound as he stood there, watching the cabin. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into my truck, started the engine, and sped down the gravel driveway, the headlights cutting through the rain. I didn't look back. I just drove. Hours later, I arrived at a small town, heart still racing, hands still shaking. I pulled into a gas station and sat there, staring at the road ahead of me. I had no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. The rain had finally stopped, and the world seemed eerily quiet. The woods, the cabin, everything I'd left behind felt distant now, almost like a bad dream. But I knew I'd never return there. Something about that night had changed me, made me aware of how easily the peaceful isolation of the woods could turn into something far more sinister. I didn't know who had been at my cabin, or why they had been there, but I was sure of one thing: I wasn't going back. The woods weren't as safe as I once thought.